Good morning, men and women of Christ. Back with you with part 2 of this spirit-led teaching. Christ is the forgiveness of God. Christ is the forgiveness of God. Ephesians 3:19 says that to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that we might be filled with all the goodness of God. To know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge. That's human knowledge. Because once we're born again, we're saved from the flesh. We're born back into the mind of the Spirit, of Christ's Spirit, so that we might be filled with all the fullness of God. All the fullness of God. I said goodness of God, but it says fullness of God, that we might be filled with all the fullness of God, which is in Christ. 1 Corinthians 1:30 says that he has made all things unto us, wisdom, righteousness, sanctification, and redemption. Wisdom, righteousness, sanctification, and redemption. 2 Corinthians 5:19 says that, to wit, that God was in Christ, reconciling the world unto himself, not imputing their trespasses unto them. He wasn't imputing our trespasses unto us, but has given to us the ministry of reconciliation. That's the ministry of reconciliation back to him through Christ. God was in Christ, reconciling the world unto himself. That means that the only way to God is through Christ. Not a preacher, not a church, not through water baptism, not through the Lord's Supper, not through the Bible. By none of these things are we reconciled to God. Being reconciled to God is an eternal work of Christ alone. A church has nothing to do with that. A minister, someone in a pastoral office has absolutely nothing to do with that. The Lord's Supper has nothing to do with that. Going to church has absolutely nothing to do with that. The Bible itself has nothing to do with that. This is alone an eternal work of Christ. He alone carries out this work. Because Christ is the work of God. He's the only one that can bring about eternal salvation to the spirit. Your soul can't be saved. Your flesh can't be saved. It is your spirit that must be saved. And then through your transformed spirit, the soul is eternally redeemed. And then the flesh comes under the eternal government of the fruit of the Spirit so that we can be led. The flesh has to come under the government of the Spirit in order to get it out of the way of the Spirit. In order to get it out of the way of the Spirit. So, the way to God is through Christ. He's the wisdom of God. He's the righteousness of God. He's the sanctification of God. Okay, wisdom, righteousness, sanctification, and redemption. All right, he's all that to us. So we have to be in the mind of Christ so that we can walk in the righteousness of Christ, who is the righteousness of the law. Romans 6, chapter 6, verse 1 through 4. Romans chapter 6, verse 1 through 4. It says, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Well, the answer to that would be no. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? No. 2, God forbid. How shall we that are dead to sin live any longer therein? We have to die to sin before we can be made alive from sin. See, the only way to be free from sin, from death, is by death. But Christ died a sinless death. The work he carried out in Jesus was sinless. So when his death is applied to us, we die a sinless death, and then we're resurrected from sin. When our spirit is resurrected from sin, and we're back in the mind of his spirit, we're in the forgiveness of his spirit. Not only in the forgiveness of his Spirit, but also in the liberty of his Spirit. Number 3 says, know you not that so many of us as were baptized into Christ were baptized into his death? We were baptized into his death because we had to die to sin. You can't be saved from sin until you first die to sin. Because if you are saved from sin without first dying to sin, then you got saved in sin. That's the sinner saved by grace. That's the enemy's deception right there. That is the enemy's deception. He makes people believe they were saved from sin without being conscious that they had to first die to sin. So that eliminates the work of Christ. That eliminates the work of Christ. So this is where you get the church philosophy of the sinner saved by grace. There is no such thing as a sinner saved by grace. Grace saves you from sin, not in sin. Therefore, 4 says, therefore, we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so shall we also walk in the newness of life, which is the newness of the Spirit, which is the forgiveness of the Spirit. You're operating in the spirit of forgiveness. And forgiveness of sin is liberty from sin. Forgiveness from sin is liberty from sin. We go back to Galatians 5:1. Stand fast in the liberty wherewith Christ had made us free, and be not again entangled with the yoke of bondage. So we have to stand fast in the liberty by which Christ made us free. How did he make us free? Through his death and the resurrection. That eternal work that he carried out, that Christ carried out in the physical body of Jesus. That eternal work that he carried out in the physical body, because Jesus had a spirit in that body. He had a spirit and a soul in that physical body that hung on the cross. The eternal work was carried out within the body. This is why we walk by faith, not by sight. The enemy also, who binds you to the flesh, he wants you to see the cross as a work of the flesh, where you're limited to sight. You just see Jesus' body hanging on the cross, and that's it. You see his body hanging on the cross, but his spirit was crucified to sin. That's where faith takes you. Faith brings your spirit into that eternal work that was carried out within Christ's spirit. So you experience the death and resurrection, the same death and resurrection that Christ did, because he died a sinless death. And when his death is applied to our spirit dies sinless to sin. We die a sinless death to sin, and that's how we're resurrected from sin. That's how we're resurrected from sin. And as we begin to be restored back to the image of Christ in the mind of his spirit, he comes to the soul and then to the body by the fruit of the Spirit. This is how we become spirit-led people. Now you have the evidence of forgiveness. You being spirit-led is the evidence of forgiveness. The fruit of the Spirit is the fruit of forgiveness. That is the fruit of forgiveness. And this brings us to a conclusion of part 2 of this teaching. And I'll be back with you with part 3. Love you with the love of Christ.